This is Tim.
And this is Kumar.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics, sponsored by ComicsNow.com. An episode that we weren't sure we were going to get to actually do due to technical difficulties, but we finally got stuff sorted out here. And I'm in Japan. Kumar is in Australia. So this is an all Eastern Hemisphere podcast.
That's right. Yeah.
So screw you, Western Hemisphere. We don't need you anymore. At least not for making the podcast, maybe for listening to it. But
Right.
Anyway, so we decided we wanted to do some more podcasts together. Kumar's only been on one other time before, although he's been discussed a number of times.
Yeah.
So Kumar suggested a few things that we could talk about, and what we're doing today is called the Four Immigrants Manga.
Right. Well, you wanted to do a San Francisco book, right?
Well, yeah, we talked about doing a
related
San Francisco episode, and the other book we were going to talk about hasn't come yet. So, but I think this one will carry us through an episode on its own.
Sure.
Just a little background on what this is. It's by a Japanese immigrant to the U.S. He was in San Francisco between 1904 and the 1920s.
Right. And he made a couple of trips back and forth. Right. And then it seems like the manga wasn't actually done while he was there the first time. It seems like he went back to Japan and then he did it in Japan, or I can't remember the details, right? But he didn't do it while he was on the spot anyway.
Right, yeah, it was actually done in the 20s or 30s.
Right. And the point about that is it's about his life in San Francisco. It's not...
Yeah, it's autobiographical.
Right. Which is why that detail is important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And his name was Henry Kiyama, Japanese name Yoshitaka Kiyama. And this book was translated and edited by Frederick L. Schott, who did a book called Manga that I guess came out in 1983.
Yeah, something like that. It was one of the first big kind of introductions to manga for people who weren't aware of it. Definitely in 1983. Yeah. And he's currently... he translated the Astro Boy series for Dark Horse, and he has a new book coming out called the Astro Boy Essays or something like that. Yeah, but he's kind of a big figure in the manga world.
Yeah, or at least the sort of the English manga world, we should say, maybe the manga translation world.
Yeah.
So, I guess what stood out for me, since this is pretty much based on fact, on history, and on what happened with him and his friends, what stuck out for me was all of the basically racism against Japanese that was going on at that time.
Yeah, but that's kind of I don't know. It's almost so much a given, and the book is not. It's not a cold, serious kind of thing. It's a very
it's done as a gag manga, pretty much.
Yeah. So
on serious topics. Yeah.
Right. But it's almost. I don't know how to react to the racism, because we know about the racism that was there, and he treats it so humorously that it's kind of hard to. It's so lighthearted. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to feel too much. You feel sympathy, but you don't really feel any pain. Mm-hmm. I guess.
But it gives you sort of a context for what happened in the 40s of World War II and the internment camps and all that.
Right. Yeah. Right. What would come down the line? Yeah. And that's something we should mention too, because the book it's kind of an amazing package in itself, because it has this long introduction about how the work was discovered and biographical details about Kiyama, and then we get the manga, which is 52 basically 52 episodes because apparently he had planned it to run in a newspaper for 1 year.
And each episode is 2 pages with 6 panels per page.
That's right. And at the end, there's a whole lot of footnotes, including lots of cultural and political things that were going on. And there's an obvious it's very obvious that the infrastructure exists for these internment camps to be set up.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as World War II rolls around, it's very easy to just kind of point fingers at the Japanese and throw them in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there seemed like on sort of a micro level and a macro level there was racism, because there was this anti-Japanese legislation coming along, and there was this whole kind of anti-Japanese organization against them. And then, on individual level, of course, there was racism too, but eventually, by sometime in the 20s, there was Congress passed a law that basically just outlawed Japanese immigration.
Right. And there was something about banning them coming in via Hawaii, but they were allowed to come in.
That was sort of a step on the way, and then eventually just outright no Japanese. Whereas for the Europeans, there was at least some kind of a quota. Some Europeans could come in, but Japanese none. So
that's right, because there was something about the quota system, because it wasn't actually a percentage, it was actually a number.
Mm-hmm.
But since there were so many fewer coming from Japan, it essentially dropped them to 0 or something. I remember vaguely some detail like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But anyway, all of these none of this is actually in the 52 strips. I mean, it kind of affects the characters, and they're like, oh, they're going to ban this or whatever. But all these kind of details come in the appendix about the exact legislations and things like that.
Right. It's written in a way that that the reader already knows the background.
Right.
Just filling in what happened with these particular characters.
Right.
But it's
he makes that.
Go ahead.
He makes that point in the introduction too, that the book is really originally it's only readable by Japanese living in San Francisco, because it's written. The original was written in Japanese with some bits in English, which means if you were in homeland Japan, you wouldn't be able to understand any of the English bits, and if you're American, you wouldn't be able to read any of the Japanese bits. You'd have to be bilingual. And also there was so many kind of cultural details, like all of these legislations and things coming in, and locations and names of buildings and things in San Francisco, that unless you were a local, a lot of it really wouldn't make any sense to you. So it was written for a very specific audience. But somehow it's been transformed into this very universal thing by the cleverness of the translation and the package they put it in with the introductions and the appendices and things like that.
Yeah, so he's done it in a way to preserve the kind of distinction between what was in Japanese and what was in English, where he's left the English as it was in Kiyama's own handwriting, with his own English mistakes, and the Japanese is translated into good English that's written in Times Roman.
Typed. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he says that leaving Kiyama's English intact sort of creates the feeling of the English being a second language to the immigrants. And not completely understanding. It works.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing, because you hear, in a sense, these Americans are speaking bad English, but you hear the English that was entering the ears of Kiyama and his friends.
Yeah.
It's really clever that he left the broken English in the way it is there, even if it's being spoken by native speakers.
And I was going to mention also that besides the racism, the other parts of history enter in here, like the earthquake in San Francisco, and there was a World's Fair, I think.
Right.
So it's interesting to see those bits of history pop up and through the immigrants' eyes on top of it.
Right. Well, there's something interesting there too, because even though it's 52 episodes, which means that it's supposed to run for 1 year, actually those 52 episodes run over 20 years or something, right? 1904 to 1924. So you see all of those events. You see the earthquake.
Uh,
and the Expo and
yeah.
all the legislation come in.
Not a World's Fair, but the Panama Pacific International Exposition.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the timing is kind of weird because some episodes seem to be a couple of days apart, or the same day,
Mm-hmm.
or a week later, which is what you'd expect in a weekly comic. But then some of them are like 5 years later. And some of them, even in one panel, you can skip like 7 or 8 years because there's one at the end. One of the guys gets married to this woman who has 3 kids, I think, right? Already.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the next panel, he's like, well, now we have 3 of mine as well. So between panels, they had 3 kids. Especially towards the end, they started just making these huge leaps in time. Which is quite bizarre, given that it was supposed to, conceived as this kind of weekly thing. But,
yeah, well, and sometimes it seems it's kind of contradictory too, as Shot notes that at one point one of the characters is talking about his father in Japan has died, and then later he seems to have become undead here again.
Yeah, right. He gets a letter from his father or something like that after he's died. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that, but the time like.
Yeah, I wondered if
there's also an excellent. My favorite one in the whole one is where Charlie, this one of the 4 guys, they've all taken American names, and Charlie has decided he's thinking about going off to war, for the glory or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's 2 panels of him on the battlefield, hacking this guy to bits, and the next panel he's like returned home from the war, so he's been off for like a couple of years, and he's killed a couple of people or whatever, and come home. Quite hilariously in the series of about 4 panels.
But on the father dying and not dying thing, I'm not sure how far apart he did those strips, but he may have just forgotten that he had.
He may have forgotten, or he may have gotten the fathers of the characters mixed up or something.
Well, yeah, Shot mentions that he did some composites of actual people into the scene, so that may be what happened too.
Right.
But then he forgot that he had killed that character's father off already.
Right. Yeah. And Kiyama himself very rarely appears in the book.
Yeah, I noticed that. He's shown occasionally working on his art, but then
whenever
disappears.
He shows up, almost he's working. He's in his studio painting like mad, and then people show up, and then usually Charlie shows up and is desperate. To talk to somebody about something, and
yeah, but then when I finally got to a point where he was there again, it's like, oh yeah, gee, we haven't seen him in quite a while.
Right. And well, let's talk about that too, because he's actually he's depicted cartooning, and there's a bit of his artwork at the beginning of the book, and it's photorealistic. It's the most amazing kind of detailed, beautiful paintings that practically look like photographs or so, lifelike, and he's got this kind of really typically crude cartooning style of the time. It's completely divorced from whatever he was learning at art school anyway.
Yeah, well, and Shot goes into something about how it was really odd at that time for someone who could do like serious art to turn around and do comics.
Right.
Because they were considered like completely different art forms that the same person wouldn't, indulge in both of them, regardless of their national background.
Right. But that was kind of, the pre-war was kind of the golden age of newspaper cartooning. Really, especially in that style. I mean, things like Bringing Up Father and Little Nemo and Polly and Her Pals and Crazy Cat and Popeye were all in the papers at that time, and those were all really kind of amazing strips. So I guess he was. And
they were just starting to get translated into Japanese too.
That's right. Yeah, Bringing Up Father definitely was showing up in Japan. And several other countries. So he would have. You can see how he would have modeled himself, or he would have really been attracted to that style of cartooning and wanted to do it himself. which makes me wonder if maybe there really is something about the Japanese personality slash character that is attracted to manga as an art form. You know,
Hmm.
if going back to 1904, he had become that enamored of it that he decided that that was the form he wanted to work in himself, to some extent anyway.
Yeah, well, and I think it has some native predecessors in Japan too. You know, I mean, they didn't have
Yeah.
word balloons, but there was, sequential
Right.
art.
Right.
Um, oh, I what surprised me too, because it felt so modern to me, was that there were a
Mm.
couple of places where he broke the fourth wall and said, like,
Yeah.
admitted that they were in a comic. Like,
Right.
the guy who's creating this comic will fix that
Right.
problem for us.
Right.
And that was
Right.
something I really didn't expect.
Yeah, that's what they would call these days postmodernism, which is something you
Yeah,
really
that
associate
word was
post
running around in my
1950s,
mind. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also something that happens in Japanese comics all the time,
Mm.
even in sometimes quite, semi-serious Japanese comics.
Hmm.
But you almost never see in American comics, even in strips. I almost never remember a strip where sometimes they turn to the camera and deliver a punchline, but I have almost no recollection of anyone actually saying they were in a comic strip,
I can
or the
think of
guy
a
who created
few.
this comic strip.
Um, Pearls Before Swine. It happens a
Oh,
lot.
right.
Hmm.
Okay.
And I don't in Marvel, there are a few characters who are aware that they're in comic books. Deadpool
Okay.
and Rick Jones has been known to mention it.
Okay. She-Hulk used to do it all the time when
Yeah,
John was writing it too.
Burns She-Hulk, right? Hmm.
But pre-1950, I mean, in the newspaper
Ah,
strips, I can't think of a
350.
Crazy
Yeah, you're
Cat
right.
or
That far
anything like
back.
that.
Hmm. It was. I'm
But
sure it was
even
rare.
that in 1924, Kiyama was admitting that it was a comic strip, which is something typical in Japanese strips. It's
Mm.
almost like he's hitting these very typical sort of these notes that you expect, these tropes that you see turn up in Japanese comics, and he's as early as you can get, he was cartooning basically.
Hmm.
It's quite amazing in that respect.
Yeah, but you can't. I mean, it's a temptation to say that he was trailblazing, except nobody in Japan really knows who he is now.
That's right. But I'm not saying he's trailblazing. I'm saying somehow there was something in the national character of some sort that even if you separate twins and then they both become lawyers
Mm.
whose favorite color is blue, they separated Kiam from Japan and it didn't matter. He was doing all this stuff that 50 years
Mm-hmm.
later people who'd never seen his work in Japan would be doing anyway.
Mm.
It's kind of what I'm getting at.
I see what you're saying. Just something in the national character, in the culture that leads to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, somehow it's like, it was okay for him to break the fourth wall in that
Hmm.
way and admit that, our manga the person writing this manga, caused all these problems for us or whatever. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Um, I in terms of the editing of the book, I thought it was. I mean, he got a lot of interesting information in here.
Mm,
Um, Personally, just from the standpoint of trying to read it,
mm.
instead of end notes, I think I would have kind of preferred the notes mixed in with the comic. Just
Oh, okay.
because I like to read that kind of stuff, but I don't like
Right,
having to keep a finger in the back of the book and
right,
flip back and
right,
forth.
right, right.
So,
Um, I don't know what to say about that because this was my second time reading it, and I can't remember what it was like the first time.
mm. Well, I mean,
But this time, I
so,
just kind of read straight through it.
hmm well, I mean,
And
I can see why he did it this way because he wanted to create this experience of just reading the comic straight
sure,
through.
sure.
But I think at least the first time through, yeah, you want that background information, or at least I do,
Mm, mm.
so that I'm flipping back and forth. I mean, I'd rather do that than read all the comics and then read the background. Because then if I read the end notes, then I'm going to be flipping back to the comics.
Right, right,
So either way,
right,
I'm flipping back and forth.
right, right. Um, Yeah, I don't know because this I don't really remember what my experience was the first time reading it, but this time I just kind of burned through it
Hmm.
and then went through the notes and then went back to the comics based on the notes, going like, oh, what was that note referred to or whatever. What did you think about the strips themselves?
Um, hmm. Well, as we've said, the sort of pacing can be kind of weird, like
Yeah,
in terms of jumping around in time.
right, right,
Um, and sometimes he would skip over parts that I kind of wanted to see what happened.
right, right, right.
um, but yeah, I mean, they're amusing and they're well done for their time, considering
Mm,
the point of development of comics at that time.
yeah. Um, well, I mean, if you're talking about in terms of development level of comics at the time, my feeling is that they were really advanced. Like I said, I think it was really the first golden age
Hmm.
because if you had things like Crazy Cat and Popeye and things like that, or Thimble Theater at that time.
Yeah, I haven't
Um,
read a lot of that stuff, but how does that stuff compare in terms of, say, the pacing? Because I mean, other
uh,
comics that I have seen from that era have
well,
the same
that's
kind of
those
feeling.
strips are. I mean, Crazy Cat is out to lunch. I mean, it's another universe. Um, but things like Popeye and say Polly and her pals they're pretty standard newspaper pacing that is copied to this day, which is basically an event will take a whole week, or not an event, but a situation will take a week to play out. Five
Hmm.
five daily strips, and maybe the Sunday as well, where every strip the people are talking about the same things basically, and there's kind of a punchline in the fourth panel.
Hmm.
Um,
Or
so this,
maybe what I'm wanting to ask about is the storytelling techniques.
yeah, I don't, but I like I said, I've never seen anyone. I don't know. He's working in a strange form. 12 panels, even on a Sunday page, is kind of a.
Hmm.
The whole thing strikes me is pretty unusual.
Yeah.
Um, not by the norm, but anyway, my point is that I think that the comics of that time were not really. You could say they were in a developmental stage, but there was some superb work coming out, which I would say is not developmental but refined and perfect.
Hmm.
And I think this book stands up really well against a lot of those.
Hmm.
Um, and I love, but I mean, in a way, like I said before, he's copying a lot of that stuff. And I loved that at least once, I think there was a panel where in the punchline, the final panel, all you see is somebody's feet like shooting into the air and the plop sound because somebody said something shocking. You know what I mean? Like where somebody's
Hmm.
fallen over and all you see are their boots and like the motion lines and then the plop sound effect or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, which I think that started with Popeye, but at least I think every strip has to do it at least once, and I was glad to see it happen at least once here. I would love to do that punchline someday in Weird Crime Theater, but that's the kind of stuff that Malele hates. Totally. He's like, "What is this crap?" And he'd make me change it. Um, I totally love that, and it happened at least once where somebody's boots shot into the air at the end of the strip.
I did a strip once, not Spider Hag, but I did a strip once where I used that bit where somebody
Right.
tells a joke and it's so bad that the other person's flying over
All you see are their
backwards.
boots.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yep. Yeah. 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 That's an excellent little trick. The other thing is the lattice hinged boxing glove, which shows up once in a while in the old strips,
Uh-huh.
but isn't in this book. But
No.
anyway, speaking of which, what did you think of the racial caricatures of non-Japanese races,
Yeah, that was
specifically Chinese and
interesting.
blacks?
Yeah, he Shot points out that that Kiyama is just imitating what European American cartoonists would do to depict blacks and Chinese
Right.
at that time. Um, yeah, but it's sort of interesting that he made that choice to portray them that way,
Mm,
particularly the Chinese.
yeah.
Um, with their hairs in the queue and the slanty eyes and.
Yep, and the really bizarrely broken, really badly, obviously broken English, rather than not, accidentally broken English.
Yeah, it's not his Japanese English. It's intentionally Chinese broken English. You're right.
Right.
And yeah, then there aren't very many blacks, but occasionally they show up, and they're the blackface blacks with the big white lips.
Right.
I don't know. What can you say? That was the time. I mean,
yeah.
I can sit here and condemn it, but what's the point? It's
right.
done 80 years ago.
Well, the point I was going to make was that it's not even condemnable. It doesn't seem, because it's so
over the top.
I don't know. Maybe it's it just the whole book seems so bizarrely innocent. Despite all the horrible stuff that's going on, like the racism against the Japanese, which, as I said, he treats very lightheartedly, and the earthquake happens, and it's just kind of, he gets some punchlines out of it. It was really, I don't know, because often I read things like, Gasoline Alley, which was an amazing strip. But every time you see the black maid or something, it kind of stings a little bit. And in this book, somehow it was bizarre. It felt bizarrely innocent, kind of naive to me, more than ignorant. It just seemed like a cartooning shortcut sometimes, more than anything else.
Yeah.
But there might have been, I think the thing with the Chinese was, as one strip points out, that often the Japanese were mistaken for Chinese. And they had very different social functions. So for a Japanese to be mistaken for a Chinese, I can understand how some resentment would build up between the two groups, and how in his cartooning he would not treat the Chinese very well because of that resentment.
Yeah. Also, when Schott goes into a little bit about the history of the immigration and of Chinese immigrants who were largely filling the shoes of the emancipated black slaves, which is sort of interesting. And then Japanese followed them after Meiji Restoration and population explosion in Japan. And what came to my mind was that, like, when I was a kid, basically the only sort of kind of the two main East Asian cultures were Japanese and Chinese. Those are what everybody knew. Other than maybe for the wars that took place around that time. I mean, people didn't really know Vietnam, Korea, Laos, all that stuff, and because people from those countries hadn't really immigrated to the States like the Japanese and Chinese had.
Yeah.
Of course, that changed in the 70s, but
sure.
So I just thought that was interesting too. But
yeah,
how did you know of this book?
I have no idea. I read about it. I think I saw an article or something promoting it somewhere years and years ago. And I thought, oh, that looks really interesting, and I didn't buy it. And then I found it in the sale bin at the comic shop on one of their big discount days, and I said, oh, there's that book I heard about, and then I picked it up. And I'm glad I did, because it's turned into one of my favorites.
Yeah, it came out in 1999.
Right.
So
it was quite a while ago. I was in Japan at the time, so definitely didn't see it on the shelf anywhere.
Okay, and just to be a good reviewer, I should say who published this. Stonebridge Press. Yep. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, they do a lot of Japan-related books.
Right. Yeah. But, it must be Ishibashi, right?
Yeah, I think it's translation of Ishibashi. Stonebridge is located in Berkeley, according to this. But some connection to Ishibashi. Was there Ishibashi Publishing in Japan?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just imagining, because it's called Stonebridge, that
Yeah, it seems like, yeah. I mean, for our listeners who don't know, Ishibashi is a fairly common Japanese family name. So, and it means stone bridge. So,
Right.
okay.
I've recommended. Unfortunately, most of my recommendations for books to review are a few years older because I'm behind the times.
Well, join the club.
In terms of comics publishing, I'm like, oh, let's do this book, and then I look, and it was published, 10 years ago. So, doing a podcast about it now really, although it's fine for us, and the concept of deconstructing comics does nothing for the publishers who have let the book fall out of print 6 years ago.
Well, this was still obtainable from Amazon,
Okay.
so I don't think it's out of print. But I mean, Brandon and I have talked about other fairly old graphic novels that we just found out about recently, and they're still being published in most cases. So.
Right. Well, I've been thinking about things, and I'm like, oh, wait a second, that's so hard to get. You got to dish out $40 on eBay to, if you're lucky, 1 week to get a copy or whatever. So. But anyway, yeah, this is an older publication, and unfortunately, like I said, I barely it registered on my radar, and then I didn't buy it for a long time, and I think unfortunately that might be the case with a lot of other people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know I've done that a lot too with books or with music or whatever. Just like buy some CD 20 years after I thought I wanted to buy that one, but
right, right. But I think it's an excellent book. Even if the cartooning is not up your alley as a historical object, it's really pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd recommend this for anybody who's interested in Japanese history, or in the history of San Francisco, or in the history of comics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think I believe it's pretty hilarious and excellent. Especially, there's basically 4 main characters, and Kiyama's one, and he barely shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And one becomes a farmer, and the other guys are basically working around town as houseboys, just doing cleaning jobs and stuff like this.
And nothing ever seems to go right for them.
No, that's right. Well, things that go right are not worth cartooning about.
Yeah, well, that's what Charles Schultz said too. Happiness isn't funny.
Right. Right. Yeah, they get into all sorts of trouble. They get fired, and there's all sorts of communication breakdowns because of language or whatever, and they're kind of unfairly dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times.
Yeah, for
but
breaking dishes or something.
Right. But the guy Charlie he's hilarious, I think. And there's a scene especially where they see these Japanese immigrants being carted in almost like cattle in this carriage, and he's so angry that he ends up gnawing a telephone pole.
Yeah, a light post.
This panel of him with his rage in his eyes, biting into this telephone pole is just the funniest thing. And the scene, as I mentioned before, my favorite one, where he's on this battlefield and he hacks this guy to pieces quite hilariously
with his samurai sword.
Which I again, maybe this is again that national character thing, but I can't imagine that ever running in a U.S. newspaper.
At the time or now, or either one.
Either.
Well, yeah, now it would just fall into the too offensive category that all the grandparents would start writing nasty letters to the paper.
That's right, because this guy gets his head chopped in half first, and then gets his body cut into 2 pieces at the waist. But it seemed to be no problem for this Japanese guy. This is just comedy. It's comedy violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I don't know. I can't imagine violence like that playing in. Well, I mean, if the strip was intended to run in local Japanese American newspapers, maybe, but any other, I couldn't imagine it happening.
Yeah, any mainstream publication that children might see at any time in our history,
right.
or at least in the 20th century.
Right. Well, there's another question for you, because it's mentioned in the introduction, it never ran in a newspaper, although it was intended to, because he did 52. I don't know if he submitted it and it got rejected or whatever. But what did you feel it was it should have been read in one a week, or did you feel it was better to read all 52 in one sitting?
Mm, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess usually anything like this, I'd sort of prefer to see them together if there's any kind of continuity, because
Right,
otherwise I forget what happened last time.
right, right, right.
um, unless it's something that's really too dense to handle in large quantities, but this
Mm,
isn't. This is. I
mm,
mean,
mm.
this. I think I like reading the whole book at once.
Right, right, right. I'm kind of two minds about it because of that weird, those jumps in years. It feels like if you read one a week, suddenly you'd hit the next week and it would be 10 years later, and you'd be like, what's going on? Or, um,
Last week he was
uh,
single, and this week he has 10 kids.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, that actually happens to the farmer guy. The farmer
Yeah.
guy gets married.
Hmm.
He gets a mail order bride
Hmm.
sent over from Japan. He gets married, and then the next trip he's got like 8 kids. Literally like 8 kids. Um, so I'm wondering if weekly would have been a really kind of disorienting. I mean, it's disorienting anyway, but it
Hmm.
might have been even more so to have to read one a week. So maybe
Well,
it's better to read
I
it the way
think
it
I
did.
think it's less disorienting when it's all at once. You can kind of accept the skip ahead in time.
Right, right,
Like, okay, now it's a little later, and they've got 6 kids. Okay.
right. And also, even though he'd planned these 52, and we don't know what he had planned next. I guess there's sketches for future episodes at the back, but it
Hmm.
ends with a kind of season finale where Kiyama goes back to Japan, and it's like that's the end of the strip almost. It's almost like a finished book
Hmm.
itself, anyway.
Oh, I wanted to mention in a few places he uses this interesting technique that I don't think I've ever seen. Certainly not in a modern comic.
Oh, I know what
Um,
you're going to mention, right?
where they're talking about something off panel, and within his word balloon, they show pieces of what he's looking at off panel.
That's right. They're at a parade, and they're standing
Hmm.
behind all the people.
Hmm.
And the way the panel is, I mean, you're looking at their backs. So it's their backs and then the crowd in front of them of all these giant Americans. And you can't see anything. But the word balloons actually depict what's in the parade
Hmm.
rather than words,
Yeah, rather
which
than having like two
there's a
panels, like a
drawing, right?
split panel or something like I'd expect to see
Right,
nowadays.
right, right. I've almost never seen it before, and I read, as I said, this is my second time reading it. Even reading it the second time, I gasped when I got to it because it was it was such a virtuoso cartooning technique,
Hmm.
which you almost never see, and you see it so little that even the second time around reading it, I was like, "Holy cow, what's that?"
Hmm.
I was just as shocked the second time to see this amazing technique. I've seen it once or twice before, um, but never this effectively.
Hmm.
Um, and again, that's why I say this is not. I don't think this is crude cartooning at all. I think it's really masterful, and I think that page is one of the pages that
Yeah,
that
it's an
shows that.
imaginative technique. Yeah, here it is. It's
Yeah,
the visit by the president.
right, right,
Taft comes.
right.
Yeah. Hmm. And I noticed flipping through here, it's used in one panel earlier on where they're going by the prostitutes who are in the
Oh,
little
right, that's
cages,
right. Yeah, that's
which is
right.
kind of
Yeah,
bizarre in itself. But yeah, then he
right.
as a close up on them, he puts that in the word balloon.
Right. That to me that was less like it was less shocking because in that case the reader can see the window anyway.
Hmm. Just
But
to
in the case of
further
the
in the
parade,
distance.
there's
Hmm.
the only way to communicate to the reader what the characters are seeing is by putting that image in the word balloon almost.
Hmm.
Um, I've seen it. One other place that sticks out of my mind is in We Three by Grant Morrison
Ah.
and Frank Whiteley. Have you seen that?
I know what it is. I've seen frames of
Well,
it,
it's
but.
kind of it's about these genetically engineered animals
Hmm.
that you know by the government that escape or whatever. But there's a scene where you kind of get things through the perspective of a dog, as I recall. And there's a scene where this woman is indicating something in the newspaper, and it's just a woman pointing at a newspaper headline, but there's actually a word balloon which goes out, and it's kind of a translucent word balloon that encompasses the newspaper. So you know that that's what she's talking about. Or as the dog would understand it. And it was really quite amazing there too, but that's really the only example that sticks out in my mind that clearly. And it was quite amazing there too, but this was, 70, 80 years earlier, right?
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd like to say about this before we wrap it up?
I don't know. I think I've covered it all.
Okay.
But I think it's really great.
Yeah. So recommend this and maybe put an Amazon link to it on the site, since I'm sure that Comics Now unfortunately wouldn't have this, since it's not something that's solicited through Diamond. So
right, exactly.
Check the kryptonite before you try to break a horse.
You might not be able to get the Four Immigrants Manga from ComicsNow.com, but they have thousands of other comics and graphic novels from comics publishers large and small. Anything you find in Diamond Previews can be bought from Comics Now at 30% off. Subscribe to your books, or even just one book, and get 35% off whatever you order. For more information, contact them through the contact page at comicsnow.com. Many of the comics we review on this podcast are supplied by comicsnow.com, and they also provide Eric's newsletter, featured on our site, globalcomics.net. You can order the Four Immigrants Manga from Amazon.com by clicking on the link on the podcast page of globalcomics.net. Our theme song is performed by Firewater. Let us give you some feedback on your comic. Send it to us at podcast@globalcomics.net and we'll review it on the show. Also, if you'd like to send us a donation to help keep the show going, use the PayPal link on the podcast page at globalcomics.net. Next week, Brandon and I will be talking about the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the Black Dossier. Till then, thanks for listening. This is Tim. See you next week on Deconstructing Comics.